In this lesson, we'll begin by talking about the basic building blocks for layout using Bootstrap 4. There are three major pieces or components in Bootstrap's grid layout system. At the very top, you have containers, and containers have one or more rows, and each row is comprised of one or more columns. Now, that's the terminology that's used in the Bootstrap documentation. However, I want to make a small differentiation and say that a row is made up of individual cells. Each cell is sized using one or more, or from 1 to 12 columns. And so in my way of explaining this, a cell is a unit of content, and each individual cell is sized by defining how many columns that it will require. And so in that sense, columns are a unit of measure, not necessarily a unit of content. And hopefully this will be borne out and become more obvious as we're working through an example. But in order to start, you have to begin with a container class. And there are two container classes that you can use. And essentially, you can think of a container as defining the boundary box, the boundaries for the widths of each of the rows, which in turn define the widths of each of the columns, which in turn define the widths of the cells themselves. All right. So there are two types of containers, as I said a moment ago. There is a fixed width container. So depending on your media query, you will get a fixed width. It'll be centered in the middle of your page. Or there's also a full width, or rather a fluid container, which will always take up the full width of the viewport of the current size of the browser as you have it stretched or minimized. All right. So inside of each container, then you're going to add a series of rows, which are the horizontal groupings of columns. So without saying any more, let's go and get started by adding a new HTML page. I selected the project name Bootstrap 4 course in the Solution Explorer. Now I'm going to click Add New Item, and I'm going to choose an HTML page from the Add New Item dialog, and I'm going to call this containers.html. And inside of here, we're going to modify this HTML that's automatically added for us. I'm actually going to go to the previous work that we've done in the referencing Bootstrap locally.html page. I'll hit Control-A, Control-C to copy it all to my clipboard, and then Control-A, Control-V to paste it into the new containers.html page. In fact, once we finish our work here in the containers.html, I think I'm going to make this into a template, and we'll add it to a text file so we can use it as the basis for all the other work that we do in this course without having to retype everything we're going to type here. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the two H1 tags that came along for the ride that we don't need from our previous work. Okay, so as I said a moment ago, in order to invoke Bootstrap, you have to start by defining a div and set the class equal to container. And there are two container classes. There is container and container fluid. Remember, container is going to be the fixed width container. Fluid will be the entire width of the viewport. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Let's go ahead and use the first, just the container class by itself, to create a fixed width container. Inside of every container, we're going to have to create a series of rows. And so we'll go ahead and set a new div tag and set its class equal to row. All right. And then finally, what we're going to do is create individual cells. So here's where we need to kind of explain again, and we'll go into depth in this a little bit later, but I'm going to create a cell with a column width and say I want it to take up 6 of the available 12 columns for this given row. All right. So here we have a cell, and inside of the cell, we're going to put our content, whether images or text or whatever the case might be. And we're going to say that we want this cell to take up 6 column widths, and we'll skip this MD for now. Just ignore that for the moment. So here, let's go ahead and add some content. I'll just make it very generic. First of 3 columns, something like that. All right. Or I should use the term cells, right? Instead. So first of 3 cells, and then I'm going to go ahead, copy and paste this twice. in the second cell, I'm going to say this should take up 4 columns of width, and I'll change the word from first to second. And then the final cell, I'm going to say that this should take up 2 columns of width. So if we add these 3 up, 6, 4, and 2, that should equal 12, and it does, so that's great. I'm also going to change the word to third of 3 cells. All right, very good. Now we should have a working Bootstrap page. The only problem with it is that it's difficult to see where the boundaries are. So we may want to style up our cells, and we'll do that in just a moment. But notice, if you can, here at the very outset that there's some empty space to the left and to the right of the row that you can see inside of the text. And if we were to make this really small, each of the individual cells stack up on top of each other. But if we make it a little bit larger, they are lined up in a horizontal fashion. Perfect. All right, and we'll come back to some of those ideas a little bit later, but let's go and stop right now. And what I want to do is style up each of our cells so that we can see them more easily. So I'm going to add a page level style, and I'm going to create a new class called cell. And inside of this, I'm going to provide a background color for my cell, and I'm going to use a color that I happen to know. This should be a blue color. Now, I didn't type this quite right, so I'm going to go EFF, like so, with the pound symbol beginning it in front of it. And then I also want to add a border too, just again, to make it obvious where the beginning of the cell starts and where it ends. So we'll make this a 2-pixel solid border, and I'm going to set its color, start off with the same color, but then I'm going to use the double down chevrons on this little color IntelliSense box. And I'm going to move the little circle to the right, trying to stay on the same x-axis to give it a slightly darker colored border like so. All right. You don't have to get the value exactly right. You could type it if you want, but this is just a little technique to give me a slightly darker border, but stay in the same color family. All right, and I also want to add some padding to the top and to the bottom to give myself a little bit of width. So I'll add 20 pixels of padding top, and I'll add 20 pixels to padding bottom. And I do want to say that there are new classes inside of Bootstrap 4 that will do this a little bit more elegantly. So we'll come back to that idea a little bit later. Now we need to apply that new style to each of the cells that we've created. And so I want to add a second class to each of the divs that are representing cells. And I'm just going to type in the word cell to apply that new style I just defined, using a space in between the built-in class from Bootstrap and my own custom class that I've created here. All right, now we should be able to run the application, and we see how this works. We have the first of 3 cells taking up about half of the row, the second of 3 cells taking up about a third of the row, and the third of 3 cells taking up about 1/6 of the entire row's width. All right, and you can see as I resize, the width of the container will generally stay the same until we get to a breakpoint, at which point it gets larger, but then it will stay the same but stay centered as I make it smaller until we hit the next breakpoint. And at some point we get down and we just are now looking at each of the individual cells stacked vertically on top of each other. And we'll talk about why that works and how that works in the next lesson or two. All right, so let's go ahead and stop that and stop that. Now what we want to do is take all this work that we've done and completely duplicate it. And I'm going to use a different container. I'm going to use the container fluid just to compare the two. So let's go ahead now and run the application. And you can see that the difference between the two styles of container. Whereas the top style, the fixed width container, will be a certain size for a given media query breakpoint. The bottom, or the second fluid container, will be the entire width of the viewport of the web browser, no matter what, even when we move into the scenario where they're stacked on top of each other, each of the individual cells. Okay, So that's the fundamental difference between a fixed and a fluid container. And before we end this video, let's do a little bit of prep work for the future. And so what I'll do is pretty much from this point on, I'm not going to work with the fluid container. I'll only work with the fixed width container. Which one you use really depends on what you're trying to accomplish aesthetically. And some of that will be dictated by your designer, your graphic designer or web designer from an aesthetic standpoint. So what I want to do is use what we've done here, including this custom style we built, as the basis for all future work. So I want to add a new text file. I'm going to go and select the Bootstrap 4 course in the Solution Explorer, and I'm going to select Add New Item. I want to choose the general file types under Installed Visual C# Templates. Select General, and then select Text File, and just choose the word and change it to, call it template.txt. Click Add. And inside of here, what I want to do is just copy everything in our containers.html and paste it into our template.html. And I'm going to remove the div class equals container fluid. And so now we have everything we'll need moving forward into the next video. Okay, so let's pick it up there. We'll see you in the next video. Thanks.